Hey there folks, the number one Rhapsody fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Rhapsody record, Please Don't Cry. In an era of rap and arguably even music in general, where it feels like for the first time women are given the chance to have more than just a couple of notable artists having a presence at once, more than just a couple of rappers that are able to kind of crack mainstream relevance at a time, it kind of feels like Rhapsody is one of the most important MCs out there right now. I mean, from her impassioned tackling of various corners of musical history to her often extremely thoughtful songwriting style and generally powerful presence, I don't think it's too crazy to say that Rhapsody is arguably one of the most notable, or at the very least recognizable, voices in rap today, and she has been for quite a few years at this point. If we're being completely honest, she has structured a huge amount of her career up to this point on the idea of being an open book, being a storyteller, being someone who's willing to be vulnerable. But at the same time, I think it could also be said that I don't think she's ever put out something quite as genuine and as one-on-one levels of personal as Please Don't Cry, her latest studio album and her first studio album in nearly 5 years. Look, obviously, Rhapsody is great here. I don't think it necessarily comes as a huge shock for me to say that she's a consistent performer. She's someone who has rightfully earned her fan base and her success based on her abilities as an MC alone, and that goes for a variety of qualities about her as an artist. But just as a performer, in terms of ability, in terms of flow, in terms of personality, she's kind of hard to criticize in any way that feels legitimate, just because of the fact that she's been locked into a rightfully confident sound for a number of years and album cycles at this point. And I mean, when she featured on Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly famously back in 2015, she sounded incredibly confident then. And the fact that nearly a full decade later, she's just as, if not even more powerful of a presence on her own solo material is nothing short of impressive. Whether you love the blunt tightness of a lot of her flows, or you kind of like some of her more soulful vocal inflections on some of the more soul influenced passages here, seeing as this is pretty inarguably her most soul forward record to date, I think there really is a lot to love here in terms of Rhapsody as a performer and what she's able to bring to the table. Whether you really like rapper Rhapsody, or you kind of like some of the more vocal based directions that she's kind of going in, some of the more harmonic directions that she's going in, so to speak, I think there really is a lot to at least find interesting here, even if this doesn't end up being your favorite album that she's put out. I mean, the album even features a fair amount of variety in terms of Rhapsody's overall performances. Not to say that her previous records haven't, but still, it's nice to see here on Please Don't Cry, with aggressive cuts, having a lot of aggressive performances, tracks like Back in My Bag, Diary of a Mad Bitch, which, love the Jodeci reference there, that's always nice to see, to some of the more kind of chill and down-to-earth songs like D&D It's Not Personal, which kind of require her to be a little more dialed back for some of these subjects that they cover there, but I'll touch on that in a moment. I digress. Overall, there is a huge amount of variety in the performances that Rhapsody herself delivers here, and at large, I think it could be said that Please Don't Cry is a record that pretty greatly displays how much of a versatile performer she is, as well as how well executed a lot of the sounds that she's experimenting with here are. I would actually say equally important to Rhapsody here are the features, but not because there's a huge amount of them, because the opposite, actually. There's not a lot of features here, and that's the important part to me. I think, as a whole, the idea of having a huge amount of massive features here on this record would take away from the more personalized qualities of it. I mean, this is a record that covers a lot of deeply personal material for Rhapsody, which I will touch on the lyrics in a moment. But I digress. I do think that had there been a huge amount of A-lister features on this record, it would have honestly maybe taken away from the overall idea of this being an intimate record from her, even if all of those features were really great. So it's nice to see that the features that are here for the most part, are features that are important in terms of creating the kind of sonic landscape, in terms of really defining maybe a song's bridge or chorus, but nonetheless are secondary roles compared to Rhapsody herself. I'm talking Erykah Badu on 3am, for example. And a couple of moments where there's a feature that actually does feel massive in presence, at least they do feel like they are generally pretty great. For example, Lil Wayne on Raw being a primary example of that, and that's a track that I could say technically goes against the idea of major features would take away from anything Rhapsody did here on a personal level, but between that not really being super common on this record, and also that specific example being one of the best guest verses that Wayne has laid down in quite some time, I don't necessarily think that's true, and I think ultimately what you're left with is a variety of excellent features, most of which are subtle but essential to their respective tracks, and some of which actually feel pretty massive in importance, but are infrequent enough and are strong enough that it never feels like it's taking away from the one-on-one kind of nature that Rhapsody is bringing to the table to the listener here. So yeah, the intentional lack of features ultimately works out for the better here. It allows Rhapsody to shine as a performer here, arguably more than any album she's put out in the past, and as a whole, it kind of allows most of the spotlight to go almost exclusively to Rhapsody and the various statements that she is making throughout this record, while still ensuring that there's enough variety in terms of the voices that pop up throughout the track list that things consistently feel fresh, which is kind of essential considering this record is over an hour long. Though, while all the performances are great, the thing that actually makes this the deeply personal letter to one's own self that it ultimately kind of is Rhapsody's songwriting, which is just a very deeply personal experience, not necessarily in an uncomfortable way, but certainly in the most vulnerable way that we've ever seen from Rhapsody, which is kind of saying something considering, like I said at the beginning of this review, she's kind of always been someone known for being sort of an open book in her lyrics. But I digress. At various points in this record, Rhapsody covers some of the most honest and highly developed stories that she's ever written and laid to wax to date. Some really heavy stuff throughout this record. For example, the track Stand Tall talks about societal expectations of women and the sort of uncomfortable, unnecessary fact that many people would assume her sexuality or sort of associate her with certain groups based on her own aesthetic or her own appearance. Tracks like He Shot Me, it's a heartbreaking reflection on police violence against the black community with a very mournful sort of Bob Marley nod during the chorus, or A Ballad for Homegirls, which is a very powerful dialogue between two women in sisterhood with a really fantastic Baby Tate feature there that I think ultimately provides a huge amount to that track. It's just a variety of songs that are covering a huge amount of bases, yet at the same time contain a consistent heaviness in terms of thematics, and ultimately I think that Rhapsody handles it all extremely well. I mean, I think it kind of goes without saying that everything I just listed is a topic with heaviness to varying degrees, but I really do think that Rhapsody handles all of these topics in a deeply poetic manner without ever sacrificing the sort of blunt directness that she needs to really convey a lot of what she's saying at various moments throughout this record. And that isn't to mention the fact that the overall structure of the album is very cinematic in a positive way, I would say, kind of progressing from this intro skit where she meets up with this oracle-esque figure to track after track of finding self-reflection, finding comfort in the world, finding acceptance in the world, and then finding acceptance in oneself before kind of going back into the skits by the end of the record. And then by the end of the final track on the album, Forget Me Not, she sort of meets back up with the oracle, with Rhapsody again still being the narrator, and answers the question, what is real and what is illusion, with the blunt, whatever I choose to believe, in this sort of moment of clarity and self-aware empowerment, not only allowing this record to feel like an extremely well-told story, but also allowing this record to feel like something extremely well put together from a structure standpoint. It really does feel like this record was a labor of love. You can tell that Rhapsody put a huge amount of passion into this record from a lyrical standpoint, from a performance standpoint, and even from a structural standpoint, and it definitely does all shine through here as some of the best material that she's ever put out. So yeah, as a whole, Please Don't Cry. It's a deeply personal record, obviously, but it's also an emotional journey that is pretty hard to not be moved by, even if you aren't someone that particularly cares for artists laying their souls out on the table for listeners. And I think as a whole, it's pretty easy to say that despite being a rapper, again, known for writing a lot of intense material, that Please Don't Cry is some of the most intense material that Rapsody has ever put out to date, both conceptually and lyrically, ultimately making for what I think might be my favorite project from her. And really, that's kind of saying something because all of her other material, for the most part to date, has been pretty consistently excellent. There's also some pretty consistently great production throughout Please Don't Cry, which I think is something also worth noting as well. I mean, obviously, Rapsody and everything surrounding her as an artist is what defines this record, of course, but still, there's some strong production here. I really like producer Hit Boy's sort of kind of feature on the track Asteroids. Him, of course, just coming off of a multi-year collaboration with Nas' sort of comeback era between the King's Disease and Magic records, so it's nice to see him create a really beautiful soundscape on the single Asteroids, easily one of the best songs on the record, and pretty inarguably, in my opinion, the most complex and the most interesting from a sonic standpoint. Elsewhere, I would say it's actually the versatility of Rapsody's influences and how they are incorporated into the beats of this record that really do sell this album as something extremely versatile, even beyond her as a performer. You have the triumphant trap influences of the track Black Pop Star that suit the overall vibe of that song especially well. Meanwhile, you have the pop reggae influences of the song Never Enough that provide this very kind of airy and light atmosphere that parallels really nicely with some of the heavier topics being covered throughout Please Don't Cry. And as a whole, I think that Please Don't Cry is a beautiful album in terms of performances and its songwriting, so it's nice to have that sort of reassured by the production, because there are plenty of well-written, well-performed albums that are, at the very least, made somewhat more middling because of weak work behind the scenes. So it's nice to see everything kind of reupholstered, for lack of a better term, via solid, strong production work from a variety of people. Rapsody has always been someone willing to kind of put her life out on the table for listeners, her worldview out on the table, but Please Don't Cry still manages to feel like something completely different, and I don't mean that in a bad way at all, because within this album is a variety of performances that range from intense to remarkably dialed back in a very good way, yet never lacking a love for her craft, some of the most moving lyricism that she's ever put to date, and honestly a good bit of really strong production that I'm surprised isn't being more heavily discussed in the few days that has passed since the release of this record. I would actually say the fact that this is only arguable as Rapsody's best album overall as a solo artist is more so just testament to how strong and consistent and how high her standards are overall, because this would be a magnum opus for a lesser artist. So the fact that this is just one of her better works and just so happens to have some of her best songs, but as a record is arguably not her best, or just in sort of the ability to be a contender as its best, or as her best, it's impressive in a way that I feel like not a lot of other musicians with the degree of longevity that she's had are capable of maintaining. Look, with all of that being set aside, Rapsody is a deeply human artist, and Please Don't Cry is a deeply human album. And what do I mean by her being a deeply human artist? I mean that she's about as genuine, she's about as honest as they come. She's an example of someone who is very obviously not trying to put on any sort of persona that is 100% unfiltered in her work, while at the same time never sacrificing any artistic integrity to get across any statements that she chooses to make through her music. And I think that the best qualities of being an artist within that kind of ballpark, a purely honest and purely self-aware artist, shine through on what is one of the most impressively produced, impressively written, and one of the most heart-achingly well put together albums within the entirety of rap so far this year. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this album review. Thank you for watching the Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.